I think all of us know that we have just gone through the worst recession since the Great Depression. Economic growth in the fourth quarter of 2008 was actually a negative 6.8%. In other words, the economy was contracting at that point by more than 6%. In the first month of January, 2009, we actually lost 800,000 jobs, and unemployment was surging. The housing market crisis rippled through the economy. Home building and sales plummeted. We had record foreclosures. We had a financial crisis that threatened a global economic collapse, a lending lockdown, and we saw very severe effects throughout the financial sector. Let me just say, I will never forget being called to a meeting. I believe Senator Gregg was there as well, when the Secretary of the Treasury and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve told us that they were going to be taking over AIG the next morning. And they told us that if they did not, they believed we would face a financial collapse in a matter of days. So this was an extraordinary crisis. We have just received a report from the economists Alan Blinder and Mark Zandi entitled How We Ended the Great Recession. They say, in part, we find that its effects on real GDP, jobs, and inflation are huge, and probably averted what could have been called a Great Depression II. For example, we estimate that without the government's response, GDP in 2010 would be about 6.5% lower, payroll employment would be less by some 8.5 million jobs, and the nation would now be experiencing deflation. When all is said and done, the financial and fiscal policies will have cost taxpayers a substantial sum, they say, but not nearly as much as most had feared, and not nearly as much as if policymakers had not acted at all. If the comprehensive policy response saved the economy from another depression, as we estimate, they were well worth their cost. We can now look back at the economic performance. As I indicated, in the first quarter of 2008, it was a negative 6.8%. In the most recent quarter, the second quarter of 2010, a positive 2.4%. But you can see in the fourth quarter of 2009, it was a positive 5%. So we're seeing the recovery decelerate. That has to be a concern to all of us. Going to the next slide, if we can, private sector jobs picture. As I indicated, in January of 2009, we lost over 800,000 jobs. In the most recent month, for which we have figures, we gained 83,000, a remarkable turnaround, but well below where we need to be. Let's go to the next slide if we can. Unemployment remains stubbornly high at 9.5%. It's down from its peak, but nonetheless too high. If we go to the next slide, the housing slump continues. You can see the peak there in January of 2006. We had 2.3 million housing starts on an annual basis. That was the peak. We're down dramatically off that peak to 549,000 in June of 2010. The next slide is a USA Today story headlined, "Expect Lots of Layoffs at State and Local Levels. Tight budgets, lack of Medicaid help put governments in a bind." All of us know the states, most of them have a balanced budget requirement, so when there's an economic slowdown, revenue decreases, they are compelled to cut spending. In some cases, cut it dramatically. The next slide is cuts in Europe stoke global fears. Britain and Germany plan drastic austerity measures that may hamper recovery in the United States. I also want to indicate, in my contacts with business leaders across the country, they tell me that the financial crisis in Europe has had a notable effect on the economy here. That is, they have told me almost without exception that the recovery was going quite well, until the European debt crisis hit, and that has slowed economic growth here, and certainly has affected those countries as well. If we look at the deficit, we see that under the President's proposal, the deficit will come down quite sharply over the next 5 years, but not sharply enough in the judgment of many of us. Most concerning to me is the years beyond the next 5, where we see the deficit again rising. That cannot be the course for the country. That is why the Fiscal Commission has been put in place to come up with a long-term plan to deal with deficits and debt. But what has been outlined in the President's budget for the long term cannot be the course that we take. That would simply add too much to the debt, and we're going to have to face up to that, as shown in the next slide, because this is a longer-term look by Congressional Budget Office looking at 2010 and beyond, going out to 2054. And if we stay on the current course, we will have a debt that approaches 400% of the gross domestic product of the country. Now, let me state that again. If we stay on the current course, the Congressional Budget Office tells us by 2054, we will have a debt that will be 400% of the gross domestic product of the country. Nobody believes that's sustainable. Nobody believes we wouldn't face a financial crisis well before 2054. Let me go to the final slide, which is the Chairman of the Federal Reserve Board saying that we need a credible plan to achieve long-term fiscal sustainability. Ben Bernanke, the Federal Reserve Chairman, on April 7th said to the Dallas Regional Chamber, quote, "A sharp near-term reduction in our fiscal deficit is probably neither practical nor advisable. However, nothing prevents us from beginning now to develop a credible plan for meeting our long-run fiscal challenges. Indeed, a credible plan that demonstrated a commitment to achieving long-run fiscal sustainability could lead to lower interest rates and more rapid growth in the near term." So that's the challenge before us. It's absolutely imperative that we develop a plan and implement a plan to face up to our long-term debt.